The first time Grant Whitmore forgot how to breathe, it was not in a boardroom, not during a market crash, and not the night he signed away his marriage, but the second Naomi Brooks walked into the ballroom looking like a woman who had already survived him. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala glittered over Midtown Manhattan, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble, with waiters drifting through the crowd, holding trays of champagne like they were part of the decor. A string quartet played something soft and expensive near the stage. Cameras flashed in clean white bursts. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed too loudly. Women in silk gowns leaned close and traded polished smiles. Grant stood near the center of it all in a black tux that fit him like power itself, the billionaire host, the man reporters called disciplined, visionary, impossible to shake. Then the room shifted. Naomi entered in a floor-length black dress with no glitter, no dramatic train, no need to beg the light for attention. The light found her anyway. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, and her face held the kind of peace that made him feel, with sudden brutal clarity, like a man standing outside his own life. She was not alone. Beside her walked Adrian Cole, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, not possessive, not performative, just present. Grant tightened his grip around his champagne glass until the cold bit into his palm. 2 years. 2 years since the divorce papers. 2 years since Naomi had left his penthouse with one suitcase, one winter coat, and a silence so dignified it had unsettled him more than tears ever could. At the time, he had told himself it was necessary. Efficient. Clean. He had stood in a glass office 38 floors above the city and watched his attorney slide the papers across a walnut table, while Naomi sat perfectly still, her wedding ring catching one blade of afternoon light. He could still hear the hum of the heater, the faint traffic below, the soft scratch of his own signature. He could still hear the sentence that followed, the one he had delivered in the same tone he used for mergers and dismissals. You were never the woman this life needed. Naomi had looked at him then, not broken, not begging, just wounded in a way that did not leak. Through her face, she removed the ring, placed it beside the pen, and said, then maybe this life was too small to recognize what it had. She left without slamming a door. She left him with silence, and for a while he mistook that silence for relief. Now, standing under gold light and donor applause, Grant watched her pause to greet the mayor, then the editor of a major business magazine, then a tech founder whose company had tripled in value after hiring Brooks Advisory. Brooks Advisory. Even the name landed like a private indictment. Naomi had not just rebuilt. She had become visible, not as someone's wife, not as a graceful accessory in a carefully photographed marriage, but as the woman powerful people now waited to hear speak. On the far side of the ballroom, she laughed softly at something Adrian said, and that sound traveled through Grant like truth finding a crack. A producer touched his arm and told him it was almost time for his speech. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on Naomi. For the first time in years, Grant Whitmore understood that some losses do not feel like absence at first. They feel like freedom, right until the night you see what your life could have been without your arrogance standing in the way. Grant delivered his speech that night without hearing a single word of it himself. The applause came in the right places, cameras flashed when he smiled, and the foundation board congratulated him as if nothing in the room had shifted, but all he could see was Naomi standing near the back beside Adrian Cole, listening with a stillness that made every polished sentence feel thin. When the speech ended, Grant stepped away from the podium and caught his reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bar. For one strange second, he looked exactly like the man the world admired and nothing like the man he had been in that law office 2 years earlier. That afternoon had begun with rain against the windows and the low silver light of a New York winter. Naomi had arrived 5 minutes early in a cream coat, her hair pulled back, her face quiet in a way that unsettled even the attorney. Grant remembered how she folded her gloves before sitting down, each motion neat and controlled, as if dignity could be built from small decisions. There had been no screaming, no accusations thrown across the table, no theatrical collapse for anyone to judge. Only the sound of paper sliding over polished wood and the faint buzz of the city 38 floors below. Grant had believed coldness was mercy. He had told himself that clarity was kinder than hesitation, that emotional distance was a form of respect, that ending a marriage like a business arrangement made him disciplined instead of cruel. Naomi listened as the attorney explained terms that had been revised, protected, and softened with expensive legal language, but none of it softened the truth. Grant wanted freedom from anything that made him feel accountable to a heart other than his own. When the attorney finally excused himself to give them privacy, the room grew painfully still. Naomi looked down at the papers, then at the wedding ring on her left hand, turning it once as if testing whether the past still fit. Grant could have said many things in that silence. He could have said he was afraid. He could have admitted that Naomi had spent years carrying the invisible weight of his ambition while he treated her steadiness like background furniture in a life built to impress strangers. Instead, he chose the sentence that would let him walk away feeling powerful. You were never the woman this life needed. He had not raised his voice. That was what made it so sharp. Naomi did not cry. Her eyes changed first, not by filling with tears, but by losing whatever softness had once belonged to him. She removed the ring and placed it beside his pen with such care that the small click of gold on wood seemed louder than rain. Then she lifted her chin and gave him the kind of truth no one in his world ever dared hand back to him. Then maybe this life was too small to recognize what it had. She stood, gathered her gloves, and walked out without looking back. Grant remembered staying in that office for another 10 minutes, staring at the ring, telling himself he had done the necessary thing. He remembered slipping it into an envelope and handing it to his assistant like it was just one more detail to be cleared from his desk. What he had not understood then, and what the ballroom was forcing him to understand now, was that Naomi had not left his life in pieces. She had left whole. He was the one who had started breaking the moment the elevator doors closed behind her. What made the loss unbearable was not that Naomi vanished in some dramatic storm, but that her absence arrived in pieces so small Grant Whitmore could pretend, at first, that nothing important had changed. For the first week after the divorce, the penthouse still looked perfect. The marble counters gleamed. His suits returned from the cleaner pressed and aligned. His calendar was full. His driver arrived on time. Investors still called him brilliant. At night, the city spilled gold through 40-foot windows, and Manhattan glittered beneath him like a promise he had already paid for. He told himself he had protected his future from distraction. He told himself silence was cleaner than disappointment. Then the details began to slip. It started with the things he had never noticed Naomi doing because she had done them before failure could become visible. A dinner with an overseas investor ran 20 minutes too long because no one had thought to flag the dietary restriction Naomi always remembered without asking. A charity luncheon seated two women with a decade-old rivalry at the same table, and a photograph of their stiff smiles appeared online before sunset. A handwritten note was not sent to the widow of a longtime board member, and Grant only learned of the oversight when she declined his invitation the next month. None of it was catastrophic. That was the problem. Each mistake was too small to justify panic, but together they formed a quiet pattern of erosion. The company still stood, but it no longer moved with grace. The penthouse felt worse. One Tuesday night he came home after 10 and found the kitchen dark, the kind of dark that did not offend anyone except a man who had once always returned to one lamp left on by someone who knew he hated walking into a cold room. Naomi had never hovered, never crowded him with questions, never asked him to become softer than he knew how to be. She had simply arranged life in a way that let him move through it without tripping over his own blind spots. Now he tripped everywhere. His assistant changed twice in 6 months. His chief of staff developed migraines. His younger sister, Eleanor, stopped coming to family dinners and finally told him over the phone that Naomi had been the only reason those evenings ever felt human. Even his mother, elegant and selective with criticism, set down her teacup one Sunday and asked, "Who is taking care of the parts of your life that do not appear in annual reports?" Grant had no answer. He began noticing echoes of Naomi in places that should not have held her at all. A blue ceramic bowl in the entryway where she used to leave fresh keys for guests. The side drawer in his study where spare reading glasses still rested in their case, because she believed searching for small things wasted more emotional energy than people admitted. The old jazz playlist that came on one rainy evening when the house system shuffled through saved favorites, and suddenly the entire penthouse felt haunted by competence, warmth, and restraint. What unsettled him most was the growing realization that Naomi had never demanded credit. She had made his world easier to inhabit and then allowed him to believe ease was his natural right. Months later, when one of his senior partners said during a strategy meeting, "We have lost cohesion," Grant heard something else entirely. "We have lost the person who knew how to hold the center without asking anyone to applaud her." Standing in the ballroom now, watching Naomi speak with measured calm, while donors leaned in as though her words carried actual weight, Grant understood that what he had once dismissed as small things had in fact been the architecture of an entire life. When Naomi Brooks stepped onto the stage, the ballroom did not grow louder, it grew quieter, and Grant Whitmore felt that silence more sharply than applause. The gold wash of chandelier light touched the edges of her black gown as she took her place behind the podium, calm and self-possessed, with one hand resting lightly on a stack of note cards she barely seemed to need. Her name appeared on the screen behind her in clean white letters beside the logo of Brooks Advisory, and the sight of it landed in Grant with a force that no public embarrassment ever could. Naomi did not belong to his history anymore. She had built a name that could stand in a room like this without borrowing power from anyone. Around him, donors settled back into their seats, glasses lowered, conversations fading into a hush. Adrian Cole remained near the side aisle, his attention fixed on Naomi with the easy respect of a man who never needed to be seen in order to be present. Then Naomi began to speak. Her voice was low, clear, and steady, the kind of voice that made people lean in because it never chased attention. She spoke about leadership, but not the kind men like Grant had been praised for in glossy magazines. She spoke about the hidden labor that kept institutions elegant from the outside and stable from the inside. She spoke about the people who noticed the broken seam before the whole garment came apart, the people who remembered names, patterns, tensions, birthdays, quiet resentments, and the exact moment a polished system began to crack beneath the shine. She never once looked at Grant directly, but every sentence seemed to cross the room and find him anyway. She said that some of the most valuable people in any room were often mistaken for support because they carried their brilliance without spectacle. She said the world had a habit of rewarding performance while overlooking steadiness, then acting shocked when everything collapsed after steadiness walked away. A few people gave soft, knowing laughs. One older woman near the front nodded so firmly that her diamond earrings trembled in the light. Grant stood motionless near the bar, his unfinished champagne warming in his hand, because what Naomi was saying was not revenge, and that made it worse. Revenge he could have dismissed as bitterness. This was clarity, and clarity left no place to hide. She spoke for 12 minutes, never raising her voice, never reaching for drama, never naming a wound, yet the room felt rearranged by the time she finished. Grant remembered all the times he had entered a space believing force was the same thing as authority. Naomi stood there proving that grace, precision, and truth could command a room more completely than power ever had. When she ended, the applause rose in a wave that seemed to start from the chest rather than the hands. People stood. Not all of them, not at first, but enough that the rest followed a second later. Naomi accepted it with one small nod, then stepped away from the podium as if she had simply done the work and nothing more. Grant watched board members, investors, and media executives move toward her with a hunger he recognized immediately. They wanted her insight, her discipline, her balance, her vision. They wanted what he had once lived beside and failed to value because it had arrived wrapped in loyalty instead of ego. And as Naomi smiled politely, with Adrian waiting just within reach and an entire future opening around her, Grant understood that the hardest public humiliation of his life was not being exposed as cruel. It was standing in a crowded ballroom and realizing the woman he had once diminished no longer needed him to witness her worth for it to be undeniable. After the standing ovation faded and the ballroom filled again with polished voices and clinking glass, Grant Whitmore did what he had always done when something mattered to him. He reached for influence. By midnight, a white rose arrangement taller than a dining chair had been ordered to Naomi Brooks's office. By 8 the next morning, a vintage watch she once admired behind museum glass was waiting at her front desk in a velvet box. By noon, his assistant had sent an invitation to dinner at a private club overlooking Central Park, followed by a second message offering a strategic partnership between Whitmore Holdings and Brooks Advisory, the kind of deal most firms would have spent years chasing. Grant told himself he was not trying to buy forgiveness. He was trying to show sincerity in the language he knew best. But sincerity wrapped in luxury still arrived at Naomi's door, looking a great deal like control. Naomi answered none of it. The flowers were accepted by reception and redistributed to staff. The watch was returned with no note. The dinner invitation expired untouched. The partnership proposal came back with track changes so precise they felt surgical, every inflated courtesy stripped away until only the business terms remained. For the first time in years, Grant found himself staring at a document that would not bend simply because his name sat at the top of it. 3 days later, he crossed Lower Manhattan in a Blacktown car and asked his driver to stop outside Brooks' Advisory. The office occupied the 6th floor of a restored brick building in Tribeca, elegant without trying too hard, with wide windows, clean lines, and the quiet confidence of a place built by people who valued function more than spectacle. He expected resistance from an assistant. Instead, he was shown into a glass conference room and told Ms. Brooks had exactly 12 minutes. Naomi entered carrying a leather folder and a cup of tea, not hurried, not defensive, just composed. She wore a navy suit and small gold earrings, and the afternoon light fell across her face with the same mercy it had shown her at the gala. Grant stood as she stepped in. She did not offer her hand. She took the chair across from him and set her cup down on a coaster before saying, "You have 10 minutes now." Grant had prepared words on the drive over. Regret, reflection, accountability. Yet the moment he looked at her, all of it sounded arranged, like flowers sent to the wrong address. "I was trying to do something kind," he said at last. Naomi met his eyes with a calm that did not soften for him. "No, Grant," she said. "You were trying to do something familiar." There was no anger in her voice, which made the truth harder to evade. He leaned forward. "I know I mishandled things. I know I was arrogant. I know I did not see you clearly." Her expression did not change. "You did see me clearly," she said. "You just did not think what you saw deserved respect." The words landed with terrifying precision. Grant looked down at his hands, then back up. "Tell me what to do." Naomi sat back slightly, and for 1 second the room was so quiet he could hear the muted hum of traffic 6 floors below. Then she gave him the sentence that would stay with him longer than any public praise he had ever received. "You are offering luxury to fix a wound caused by disrespect." She let that settle between them before continuing. "Flowers are not change. Expensive gifts are not understanding. Access is not intimacy. And regret is not repair unless it costs you something real." Grant felt his throat tighten, not from humiliation this time, but from the sickening recognition that she was right. He had come to her with polished gestures because polished gestures had always worked on everyone else. Naomi rose, signaling the end of the meeting. "If Whitmore Holdings wants to hire my firm, send the revised contract through legal," she said. "If this is personal, do not come here again without being honest about why you are really here." Grant stood slowly. "And what if I am here because I miss you?" Naomi picked up her tea, her voice steady and almost unbearably gentle. "Then miss me honestly," she said. "But do not confuse missing my value with loving me." Grant left Brooks' Advisory with Naomi's words still lodged beneath his ribs. But what stayed with him even more was not the way she had dismissed the flowers, the watch, or the private dinner. It was the way she had not once sounded wounded while doing it. She sounded clear. That difference followed him for days, through investor calls, through a breakfast at the Lowell, through a strategy session where 3 executives argued over numbers while Grant stared at the skyline and thought about the man who had stood beside Naomi at the gala with such quiet ease. Adrian Cole was not loud, not flashy, not the kind of man business magazines chased for cover stories, and yet Grant had seen something in him that night he could not unsee. It was there again the following Saturday when Grant, against his better judgment and with no real plan except restless curiosity, stepped into a bookstore cafe on the Upper West Side and saw Naomi near the back windows with Adrian seated across from her. Rain traced soft lines down the glass. The room smelled like coffee and paper and wool coats drying in city heat. Naomi had a book open beside her tea, one hand curved around the mug, her shoulders loose in a way Grant had not witnessed in years. Adrian was listening to her with his full attention, not interrupting, not scanning the room, not reaching for his phone every 30 seconds like most powerful men mistook for normal behavior. Naomi was speaking about a client transition, something delicate involving layoffs avoided through careful restructuring, and Adrian asked one simple question that made Grant stop where he was. He said, "What did you need in the middle of that? Not what did you fix?" Naomi went still for half a breath, then smiled in a way Grant had never been able to earn from her by force. It was not dazzled. It was not grateful. It was recognized. Adrian did not rush to fill silences. He did not perform understanding like a man hoping to be rewarded for decency. He simply made room for her thoughts to arrive fully before he answered them. Later, when Naomi stood to take a call outside, Adrian rose too, not to follow, not to monitor, just to bring her scarf from the back of her chair, because the rain had turned colder. He draped it over the armrest near the door and returned to his seat without expecting thanks. The gesture was so small Grant almost hated it. Not because it was grand, but because it was instinctive. Naomi came back in a few minutes, touched the scarf, and looked at Adrian with that same softened gaze. Grant understood then that what unsettled him was not the possibility that Naomi had moved on. It was the possibility that she had finally met the kind of care that never asked her to shrink in order to receive it. He had once believed love was proven by provision, by penthouses, reservations impossible to get, cars waiting downstairs, and a life so polished it looked untouchable from the outside. Adrian, without seeming to try at all, was revealing a truth Grant had spent 40 years avoiding. A woman did not feel cherished because a man controlled the weather around her. She felt cherished when she could breathe beside him without preparing to disappear. Grant stepped back before either of them could notice him, the bell over the cafe door chiming softly as he left. Out on the sidewalk, the rain had eased to a fine silver mist, and for the first time he allowed himself to name the thing he had lost with no protection of ego left around it. Naomi had not needed a richer man, a stronger man, or a more influential man. She had needed a kinder one, and the fact that another man had learned how to offer that before he ever did felt less like jealousy and more like judgment. 3 weeks after the afternoon in the bookstore cafe, the first crack became impossible to hide. It started with an investigative piece posted just after sunrise, a detailed report questioning labor practices inside a Whitmore Holdings subsidiary and exposing internal emails that made senior leadership sound detached, careless, and insulated from the cost of their own decisions. By 9 o'clock, cable news had picked up the story. By 10, shareholders were demanding answers. Employees were refreshing their inboxes in silence, and the communications floor at Whitmore Tower felt like a building trying not to panic out loud. Grant Whitmore stood in the center of the storm with his jacket off, tie loosened, and a headache pressing hard behind his eyes as legal advisors argued with public relations executives over language that sounded polished and empty. One vice president suggested immediate layoffs to reassure the market. Another wanted a temporary denial while they bought time. Grant listened for 12 exhausting minutes before realizing that every option in the room had been designed to protect optics first and people second. For the first time in a very long time, he did not want the clever answer. He wanted the honest one. By noon, he was in a black sedan headed downtown with a revised contract on the seat beside him and something far more difficult than corporate urgency tightening his chest. Brooks Advisory occupied the same Tribeca office, calm as ever, even with rain streaking the windows and the city humming below. Naomi received him in the conference room without surprise, as though she had already guessed that eventually his world would arrive at the door carrying consequences he could not charm away. Grant set the folder on the table. "I am not here to rewrite the past," he said. "I am here because there are 800 employees tied to decisions being made by people who care more about headlines than human beings, and I no longer trust the room I built." Naomi studied him for a long moment, then opened the folder and read in silence. The contract was clean this time. Strict scope, independent authority, no personal contact outside scheduled meetings, full discretion to review internal operations, executive communications, and restructuring plans. When she looked up, her face gave nothing away except focus. "If I do this," she said, "I do not protect your image. I protect the people your image has been placed above." Grant held her gaze. "I know." She signed before the hour was over. By evening, Naomi was in Whitmore Tower, walking through the lobby with a leather portfolio under one arm, while conversations softened in her wake. She did not move like someone returning to old territory. She moved like someone entering a problem she intended to solve. Within 24 hours, she halted the planned layoffs, identified the chain of executive decisions that had created the exposure, and rewrote the response strategy from the inside out. No staged apologies. No sentimental language. Real accountability, direct outreach, immediate employee protections, outside review, and a public statement that admitted failure without hiding behind consultants. Grant watched her from the far end of the conference room as she spoke to department heads who had once ignored voices like hers until they became indispensable. Naomi was not harsh. She was exact. She asked better questions than anyone else in the building, and somehow every answer revealed how much damage had been done by arrogance dressed as efficiency. Near midnight, after the worst of the crisis had finally begun to settle, Grant found her alone in the executive kitchen pouring hot water into a paper cup. The city glowed beyond the glass, wet and silver and sleepless. He stood a few feet away and said the truest thing he had managed in years. "I thought I was asking you back because I missed you." Naomi stirred her tea once, then lifted her eyes to his. "No, Grant," she said softly. "You asked me back because your world started breaking and you finally noticed who used to hold it together." He could not deny it. That was the humiliation and the mercy of her presence. She had come, she had helped, and she had done it without offering him even one false reason to believe that saving what mattered meant returning to what had already failed. By the end of the week, the market had steadied, the worst headlines had begun to fade, and for the first time in months Whitmore Tower felt less like a machine eating its own mistakes, and more like a place where truth had finally been allowed into the room. Naomi Brooks had done exactly what she promised. She had protected the employees, forced accountability upward instead of downward, and left behind a structure strong enough to stand without pretending nothing had cracked. She did not linger for praise. She declined 2 interviews, redirected public credit toward the internal teams who had done the difficult work, and returned to Brooks' advisory with the same quiet discipline that had marked every step of her life since walking out of Grant Whitmore's office 2 years earlier. Grant watched all of it with the strange ache of a man seeing something clearly only after losing every right to reach for it. On Friday night, after the final review meeting ended and the last executives drifted toward elevators with tired voices and loosened collars, the building settled into a rare stillness. Rain had passed an hour earlier, leaving the city outside washed clean and shining. Grant found Naomi on the rooftop terrace reserved for private events, standing near the stone railing with the skyline stretched behind her in silver and gold. She had her coat folded over one arm, her hair touched lightly by the wind, her face calm in a way that made the whole city seem louder by comparison. For a moment he said nothing. He simply stood there, a few feet away, listening to the traffic below and the faint hum of rooftop lights. Then he spoke with none of the practiced confidence that had once filled every room before him. "You were right," he said. Naomi turned, not startled, not guarded, just waiting. Grant swallowed hard. "I kept telling myself I missed the marriage, or the timing, or the way things used to work. But that is not the whole truth. The truth is that you were the best part of my life long before I understood what that meant." Naomi held his gaze, and because she did not rescue him from his own honesty, he had to finish it himself. "You were irreplaceable," he said. The words settled between them with no drama around it. Only the weight of being late. Naomi looked out over the city for a brief second before facing him again. When she answered, her voice was soft enough that he had to listen carefully. "I was," she said. "But being irreplaceable does not mean I was meant to be returned to you." Grant closed his eyes for one breath, because there it was, the final truth his money could not soften and his regret could not negotiate. Naomi had not come back to become his second chance. She had come back to prove that her worth had never depended on his recognition. He nodded once, slowly, like a man signing something far more binding than any contract he had ever held. Down below, a car horn cut through the damp night air. From the stairwell door came the faint sound of footsteps, and then Adrian Cole appeared, pausing just long enough to read the space without intruding on it. Naomi picked up her coat, gave Grant one last look that held no cruelty and no invitation, only peace, then walked toward the door where Adrian waited with a quiet patience that asked nothing from her except truth. Grant remained at the railing after they left, alone with the skyline and the kind of silence he finally understood how to hear. Some losses, he realized, do not become sacred because they can be recovered. They become sacred because they reveal, too late, the exact shape of the love you were trusted with and failed to honor.